So welcome back to the Spring Seminar 2021. This is the second panel of this seminar, and we will have three speakers. The first one is Rita Benis. Rita Benis is a researcher at Center for Comparative Studies from the Faculty of Letters in the University of Lisbon. She's currently finishing her doctorate on Manuel de Oliveira's screenplays with an FCT grant. She's a master in comparative literature. She taught screenwriting and history of cinema, and she co-edited the electronic magazine Falso Movimento, translated books and published articles, chapters on the relationship between image and writing. Her latest book, co-edited with Elizabeth Marques, Escrita e Imagem, was published by Sistema Solar Documenta in 2020. She is also an award-winning screenwriter, and she works in cinema since 2000. She has collaborated with filmmakers such as Teresa Vilaverde, Margarida Gil, Inês Oliveira, António Cunhatelos, Jorge Cramés, Vincent Gallo, and Catherine Breillat. Rita Benis will be presenting The Strange Case of Angelica, an ominous mirroring relationship, where she analyzes the film of Manuel de Oliveira, focusing on the dynamic established between the ghost of Angelica and the visible specters of the diggers. In this paper, she will be discussing how cinema can work as a fertile place or device for the production of ghosts, introducing an internal fissure in the real itself, moreover enhancing the real, by enabling the ghost of the matter to reveal itself more real than reality itself. So thank you, Rita, for being here with us. The screen is yours. When you're ready to start, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the organization and to those who are present. I hope you can see the compartilhamento tela já está disponível. So as I was introduced by João Pedro, I've been working in cinema in the past 20 years as a screenwriter, as assistant director, assistant of sound, and I also did some experiments with film, participating in gallery exhibitions in Portuguese cinema. Maybe I will continue to do so, and also working in screenwriting. My research is focused on screenwriting. My PhD is on Manuel de Oliveira screenplays. I tend to see screenwriting very attached to the filmmaking, and not to see it as a separable narratology section of narratologic studies or literary studies. I have a little bit of difficulty with that because it has some implications on my work and on Portuguese cinema's relationships with the screenwriting and film working and filmmaking. So my analysis today is focused on The Strange Case of Angelica, and I will focus on the dynamic established between the ghost of Angelica and the vine workers, figures that Isaac, the protagonist of this film, is portraying on a daily basis on the vineyards of Douro Hills. So the film tells the story of Isaac. Just to make a brief summary of the film. The story of Isaac, a young photographer who is commissioned to photograph a recently deceased young woman, Angelica, whose ghost later visits him in his dreams and becomes his fatal obsession. We will discuss through this example of this film how cinema can work as a place and device for the production of ghosts, namely introducing, as Fernando Guerreiro said, introducing an internal fissure, a gap in the real itself, or moreover, as Jean-Louis Schaeffer declared, by enhancing the real, or in Manuel de Oliveira's words, by enabling the ghost of the matter to become to reveal itself more real than reality itself. So, in the strange case of Angelica, the contrast between the episodes of the Vineworks, the sequences where the Isaac is photographing the diggers in the vineyard hills, and the other sequences. This is not good. Okay. And the other sequences with Angelica's ghost episodes or Isaac's dream scenes. These two types of movements in the film, they seem to highlight an ominous mirroring relationship between Angelica and these vineyard figures, as if the sight of the dead alive, which is Angelica, progressively starts to reflect the sight of the living dead in Isaac's impression, in Isaac's view. So most of the films of Manuel de Oliveira are known, have this common thematic that interests very much Manuel de Oliveira of a conception of passion as a condition impossible to fulfill or satisfy, in which death represents the role of the definitive promise of the fulfillment of such love. Death would come as an ultimate abyss of love. And when Manuel de Oliveira came along with an inciting incident that had a huge impact in his life, which was the death of his wife cousin in the 1950s, he was asked to take a photograph of this cousin of his wife, and he realized when he was taking the photograph that the camera made a super impression of the film and simulated like a ghost coming out of the body of the dead corpse, and that stimulated his imagination to work on the film. And besides this thematic of love, death, bound, that so much interests Oliveira, we discovered along the different screenplays of Manuel de Oliveira versions of Angelica. This one I'm showing is the first one from 1954, and this one is from 1988, and this one is from 1998, and finally this one is the shooting script from 2010. All along the different screenplays, we see another timeless theme that is emerging continuously, which is the idea of agonia. Oliveira describes it in the introduction to Angelica's 1998 screenplay publication, and he says, passing from the temporal to the timeless, as is the case of Angelica, the idea of mortal agony springs to my mind, ultimately the great struggle for survival, the heavy weight imposed by the human condition and the laws of nature. And he goes on explaining how mortal agony is present on this thematic of his film. And the idea of agony continues to appear in Oliveira discourse over the time in his interviews, and he always describes it as a fight against death. And when Manuel de Oliveira was forced by the political circumstance of Portuguese regime Estado Novo, the Portuguese dictatorship, he was pushed to the countryside where he worked on a family farm, for decades. And this period was fundamental for him to mature his personal understanding of cinema and also to strengthen his vision on subjects such as life and death, man and earth, mortal agony, all these thematics that are very important in the film of Angelica. So he went back to Earth and he learned something about the rhythms of Earth and the rhythms of cinema as well. And later he he kept on underlying this thing, this important thing to him of rituals that make life, like the agricultural gestures, for instance, and 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 he's always been very he always underlined very much how important we must never forget how man is attached to earth and beyond the facilities, that mechanical facilities that we offer each other, we are linked to nature inexorably. So at the root of the three first screenplays, we have the Second World War theme, because Isaac was a fugitive, was a refugee, a Jewish refugee, and this situation which he was in was a nightmare, and that led him towards Angelica, the ghost of Angelica. But in the screenplay of 2010, the Jewish character is no longer there, present, so much present, and the desire for the liberation of Isaac is not so attached to this fugitive condition, so he becomes a more a reaction to another extreme situation. He seems to be the only character apparently aware of identifying the imminent extinction of a human fundamental bond, which is the forthcoming replacement of the vineyard diggers by the agriculture machinery. These men will be disappearing soon. So although they are still visible in the film, they are also phantomatic figures. They are like trapped in the real, but they are ghosts of lost gestures. They are maintaining their visibility, but they are almost more spectral than Angelica herself. And their hunting capacity is something that is present but is not directly visible. Their spectrality does not coincide with their materiality or visibility, but becomes perceived by Isaac. And through Isaac, and through the presence of Angelica, we perceive as if the sight of the dead alive, the Angelica, would reflect the sight of the living dead, the diggers, and something can be sensed or perceived as an allegorical configuration in these relations between the two figures. So in the shooting script, we found that under the title Os Trancados Angélica, we find another subtitle is called Allegory. The subtitle, which appears in the form of a programmatic declaration, perhaps invites us to look at the film as a possibility of an allegory around a strangeness. That is, it reminds me not to be misled by the literal sense of the apparition of Angelica, but rather to follow its mystery, which is the allegoric chains lodged in the relationship between Angelica and divine workers. So, as such, the title and subtitle does seem to keep a strategic alliance on what is perhaps the film's most intriguing landscape, which is the one that the critic Jean-Philippe Tessé identified as its hidden heart. The episode of The Diggers is not just side by side with the story of Angelica, it's its hidden heart, like an intuition. There are too many asides not to suspect that an enigma is developing in front of our eyes, that something is hidden in the film, which in the end shortly passes by the obsession of Isaac with Angelica. So the scenes, Angelica and divine diggers, when placed side by side, as in the rope that holds Isaac's photographic work, allow us to guess like a third intuitive territory that is born from that encounter, a common spirit that is only recognizable in this confrontation. It's like a k-axis, and this common refers to something alive, an intermittence that cannot be stabilized or visible, but is like a living rule that connects these relationships, these representationships of Angelica and the diggers. When we see Angelica apparition, we are already aware of something else that goes beyond its vision, a nearby real threat, which is the imminent disappearance of divine workers' gestures, of the fading living atmosphere of a human ritual, an ancestral relationship between man and earth. And the more Isaac is aware of this atmosphere that is fading away, the more he is disturbed, the more he is haunted, the more the haunting figures of the vine diggers come in his nightmares and haunt him, and they desperately the photos become more aggressive, the agreements of the diggers expressions, and in the screenplays the last screenplay, the 2010 screenplay, Oliver is very precisely describing these figures as as ghosts, as zombies, as excuse me, like zombies, they chase him in his dream, haunting him, like figures of patibular expression, like hangman's expressions. So they are evil figures, like hangmans and zombies, spectral, lifeless figures. They are not like beasts or anything of that kind. They've become dehumanized and become spectral evil figures. And so there's this portrait of violence that is being portrayed in these figures, in these ghosts. That is not being seen by these other characters, only by Isaac. He's the only one that sees this violence that enslaves the vine diggers and enslaves humanity, a violence that has a more transcendental realm, I would say, a violence that can turn workers into cursed souls rather than beasts, with gestures closer to grave diggers rather than agricultural workers, and uh, as if the diggers were trying to reach and punish Isaac for being aware of this progressive emptiness of their gestures, their obscenity. They start to hunt more aggressively Isaac in his dreams, so it becomes unbearable for Isaac. And how does Oliveira arrive to so masterfully set free all of these ghosts? If, as Fernando Guerreiro describes death as an opaque mirror, and to be able to see anything there for a face to appear, for instance, you need to hallucinate, as in poetry. Fernando Guerreiro suggests in this wonderful book, Teoria do Fantasma, which I recommend. And Oliveira, I would say, he engenders the perfect hallucination in this film by overlapping the real and the fictional landscape in the same film set, thus transforming it into a portal. The idea of portal, a place propitious to encounter different realities, is developed in this film, Angelica, in Angelica's house. You can see Angelica's house as a magical place, a territory of overlapping realities, because the set of the film, where The Strange Case of Angelica was filmed, is Quinta das Casas Novas, which is itself the place where Dona Isabel's cousin died. It is the place where the dead woman who inspired the film died. It is the place haunted by the ghosts who inspired the film. So Oliveira then filmed in the house haunted by the ghost of the woman who inspired the character of Angelica. And as if that was not enough, Oliveira called it in the screenplay Quintas das Portas, Houses of Doors. This is the name of the fictional place. Quinta das Portas. So the set as a place of fiction is called Quinta das Portas, houses of doors. And sometimes in the script itself, you can see written, instead of Quinta das Portas, by mistake we read Quinta das Casas Novas. You can see it in green, Quinta das Casas Novas, and you can see it in pink, Quinta das Portas. You can see these mistakes appearing in the screenplay, denouncing the collage between the two overlapping places, the fiction and the real landscape of the ghost. So, in an interview to Francisco Valente, Oliveira refers to the idea of door as death, as an idea of door. And he quotes, he remembers in War and Peace, in Tolstoy, War and Peace, that was this old man who saw a door at the end of his room, and that gave him the vision that death was a portal. And so by naming the place where Angelica dies as Houses of Doors, Quinta das Portas, Oliveira seems to transfer the real place, Quinta da Casa Novas, catapults it to the layer of the fantastic, the fiction, and operating an intense game of reflections and correspondence in this overlapping of spaces, as if he was looking for the propitious circuit that could open a portal, allowing an opening, a branch, that the possibility of getting a revelation of some sort of for his chameleon obsession with the door of death. And here you find a small elegy he made to Camilo Castelo Branco, one of his favorites novelists, Portuguese writers, where he says, much more than an escape, Camilo would have the urge to arrive at the revelation of the mystery, to arrive at the door, which is open to all secrets and doubts. Perhaps that's why he loves so much death, in a love that became a desire, mythical death represented by a woman wrapped in a transparent and thin white tulle. And this last sentence could be a description of Angelica. So what if what we see in the film, more than a movement of passion or even a desire of liberation by Isaac, is also yet another form of desire, perhaps this eagerness to arrive at the revelation of the mystery of death, to open the portal in some kind of blind spot on the screen, allowing an experience, a perception, allowing a glimpse to an indescribable affinity between real and real, death, life, Giger's angelic reality image. As Manuel de Oliveira would say, we live in a secret beyond which we can only communicate it, but never explain it. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rita. We will hold the discussion to the end of the session. So we will proceed with the second speaker. Welcome back, Matthew. Matthew Mason is a PhD candidate in Culture Studies at the Lisbon Consortium. He received a BA in French and Italian from Manchester Metropolitan University and a MA in International Relations from the University of Kent in Brussels. His research revolves around the work and theory of the Situationist International, the films of Jean-Luc Godard, and the political implications of postmodernism. He is also currently engaged in teaching English at Universidade Católica Portuguesa in Lisbon. Matthew will present his paper, Spectres of Populism and Postmodernism, in the documentary work of Adam Curtis, from his works from 2015 to 2021. His paper seeks to offer an analysis of three recent works, Bitter Lake, Hypernormalization, Can't Get Out of, and the most recent one, Can't Get You Out of My Head, by the British documentary filmmaker Adam Curtis, through which he will analyze the specters of postmodernism and populism. The paper will try to suggest how the two concepts, populism and postmodernism, can be understood as vaguely symbiotic, the former in its contemporary form emerging out of the ideological abyss left by the later. Thank you very much, Matthew, for being here with us, or being there with us, and you can start when you are ready.
My apologies, not the best start. I was muted there. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, João, Pedro, and thank you to the committee for having accepted my proposal here. I must say, first of all, this is a very unique, of course, context in which to be presenting, so I'm kind of quite conscious of that. Half of us in person there, and me and some others via cyberspace, so that's quite interesting, I suppose. Okay, so just to briefly introduce this, this doesn't actually relate, as João explained at the start, perfectly with my own research for my PhD, but it's rather something I've been quite interested in, and when I was trying to think of something which could perhaps match the theme and this idea of spectres and spectrology, I thought I came up with this idea basically. But again, it's very much a work in progress. This is really me just kind of sketching some ideas and kind of asking some questions in a way, really. So I think it would be particularly fruitful for me and perhaps you, if there are any questions to be asked here, if there are things that I don't make clear, I think it's quite likely that will be the case. Okay, so the films that I've chosen to speak about today, briefly, are three films by the, well, I wouldn't say very famous, but the quite famous Adam Curtis, who's a British documentary filmmaker. Those of you who do not know him, perhaps many of you already do. And he has been making films now for a long time, several decades, in fact. And one of the things about Adam Curtis is that he works with and for the BBC, so he has access to all of the archives at the BBC, which means, of course, he has an incredible wealth of material from which he can take. So that's one of the advantages that he has. And also, over time, he has been able to kind of scratch out type of work, a position, if you like, in which he's basically left to do his own thing. Okay, so what that has meant, again, for many of you probably already familiar with him, is that some of his films many of them are very controversial, and some of the assertions made and some of the hypotheses are quite controversial. Okay, so the last three pieces made by Curtis here, the first one that I wanted to pluck out, if you like, was this film called Bitter Lake, 2015, and then Hypernormalization the year later. And then finally, and this has just been released now in February of this year, Can't Get You Out of My Head, which is in fact 6 individual episodes of 75 minutes each. Okay, so again, it's very long, and Hypernormalization is also around 3 hours long. Okay, so just very briefly, Bitter Lake, so the first film I'm interested in, ostensibly focuses on the relationship between Western powers, particularly the US and Saudi Arabia, and focuses on this idea of a narrative around Islamism. But that's basically a kind of pretext to point at a wider thesis, if you like, which is that this is a question of the manipulation of narratives, in which, whilst the people acknowledge that, whilst we acknowledge how complex the world is, we are told such simplistic stories that we know they cannot be true, but there's nothing we can do, so we just get confused about it, basically. Okay, so that's a very trivial summary, perhaps, of this first film. So that's the first film I'm interested in. The second one, Hypernormalization. This is when really, I think, Adam Curtis's work became much more famous outside of Britain. So this piece seemed to really gain traction online. It's available on YouTube, incidentally, so that's perhaps a factor. And since this period, he's been interviewed a lot more by different magazines and different newspapers, and he's become more of a public figure, let's say. Okay, now I thought I would, again, I'm terrible at time management, but I thought I would show the trailer for this film. So I'm going to go ahead and try to play it now, but my suspicion would be that there might be a technological issue. So try to play. This is the trailer for the film.
Just like the sound of a mountain top, you know I'll always come again. You know I'll spend the morning sun like summer dancing on your skin. We'll never go so long as to tell you that what you've seen is what I've been. There is nothing I thought I could. You see me better than I can.
Mister will be arriving here about an hour and a half from now.
Got some more acid over here if you want to go ahead and drop it. Politics. Don't politics. Don't vote.
What the heck is that? Oh my God. It's just moving really slow.
Thanks.
Sorry. Just trying to skip this now. I knew something would happen. Okay. So that was one of the trailers for that film. So I just wanted to show that because I thought even the trailer itself manages to convey quite a lot of what I want to cover. So that is the film, many of the different aspects of the film are captured really in that trailer. So that's the variety of the images used, from the violence to the kind of mundane or the banal, on top of a range of music which is clearly designed to kind of unsettle and confuse in a way the audience as well. So I thought that trailer captures that quite well. Now the final film here sorry. Okay, and the final film is this film. So this was just released this year, as I said before. My apologies. Let's not watch the trailer again. Okay, called "Can't Get You Out of My Head," and the subtitle for this film is "An Emotional History of the Modern World," and this really continues the director's vision, if you like, of the first two films mentioned here, but with more of an emphasis on emotion here. Okay, so the point is that these seem to me to be very interesting objects which coincide with both the theories and practice of postmodernism and populism to a lesser extent. Now, I had another clip here, but I think I will skip it because I don't want to take too long. So this is just a quote from somebody who has written about, this is a piece written in Art Review, in fact, about Curtis's latest work. And this is by Tom Wyman, and he says, along the way, so this is about what's covered in the film, Curtis introduces us to a whole host of other histories and individuals, taking in everything from the rise of conspiratorialism, the collapse of the coal mining industry, the life story of Tupac Shakur's mother, Fanny, the West German student movement, and the Voynich manuscript and trans rights. So I'm just putting this here to try and illustrate how the variety of the topics covered, basically. Okay, so it's kind of, we're jumping from one thing to another, which is at once extremely confusing, but on the other hand, very interesting. And I think this is what people quite like about Curtis's work in general. Okay, so Curtis has been described here in the very same piece as a kind of reverse Marxist. He says, and I quote, Curtis is brilliant when it comes to detailing developments in the superstructure, our culture, our institutions, our ideas and systems of power. But he is much less able to link these developments to the material base on which they are built. If Curtis is anything, he is a reverse Marxist for whom the superstructure ultimately determines the base. This, I think, is where the accusations of aestheticism, which sometimes dog Curtis, are most justifiable. Okay. Now, this, of course, is very much what we have associated with developments in postmodernism, right, which is a movement away from an analysis of material conditions into an analysis of culture and identity and ideas, so to speak. And in that respect, that encapsulates the films. Now, in terms of this notion of spectres, I thought it would be interesting to make this comparison, although it is itself torn from history inappropriately. But let's say, so of course, Marx referred to the spectre of communism haunting Europe in the original Communist Manifesto in 1848. And then about 150 years later, Jacques Derrida famously wrote this Spectres of Marx, this piece which tried to engage with some of the things which were left from Marx, which hadn't been totally discredited. And then, of course, Derrida himself as a central postmodern figure, I see as inspiring postmodernism as an idea, but also then we see this spectre of postmodernism in the work of Curtis, if you will. Okay, so again, not to repeat myself too much here, but what I see as coming out of these three films is this interest in the imperceptibility of truth. Of course, this we can link to the work by Jean Baudrillard, again Derrida, and François Lyotard, whose work was very much focused on this. Also, the problem of images, particularly their collage, as we see in Curtis, that makes us think perhaps of Peter Bohr and the work of the Situationists, amongst others. And this problematization of history as well. through Frederick Jameson. So this idea of historical amnesia, which perhaps the films do inadvertently. So two aspects we can really focus on. One, which is to see the films as reflection of postmodern themes through their content and principal concerns. So again, we see this focus on truth. We saw in the trailer there, this notion of a post-truth world. Whether or not we accept that, of course, it's highly problematic, but we can see that that's a principal concern. The second concern, which is really clear also in the trailer, I think, is this notion of political impotence, which we can also relate quite strongly to developments in postmodernism, right? Which is this idea that we no longer believe that anything can change. Okay. Again, a lot of this sounds quite conspiratorial, of course. I understand that. Curtis does that clearly to provoke. But my interest really is in seeing the films as a kind of reflection of this intellectual tradition. And finally, the last point here would be, particularly in the second film, Hypernormalization, we see a real emphasis on the 1970s, which again is precisely the period which many of these thinkers, so Frederick Jameson, Terry Eagleton, have theorized that it was really the 1970s which were the turning point for the postmodern, if you like. And the second thing, this is a still from Can't Get You Out of My Head. So here we can see this. Again, it's probably quite cliched, this relation to consumer society, but we see that very clear in the films. Secondly, we can see the films themselves as postmodern objects in terms of their techniques and style. In Hypernormalization, there's one sequence which I think is particularly an extreme case of this, which is where we see the images of the capture and subsequent murder of the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu alongside a Jane Fonda fitness video. So we see those two there, which have clearly been used to provoke a kind of reaction, but at the same time, it's problematic in and of itself. And we could identify that as a kind of postmodern style, I believe. Secondly, is this the mixing of high and low cultural references. And finally, this collage of images. Okay, here, this is the still from Hypernormalization, from the Jane Fonda fitness video. And I found this particularly interesting because when I had been reading Terry Eagleton, in fact, this is a quote I put here on the left. He kind of cynically suggests that the socialism of Guevara of a certain period gave way to the somatics of Foucault and Fonda. So again, they're playfully putting Jane Fonda alongside Michel Foucault. But I found that really interesting that Curtis really plays on that, and we can see that in this still here, right? And then finally, although what seemed most clear to me was postmodernism, but I also found that we can see a kind of populism also in Curtis's work. And I've seen in interviews that he has done where he really does pit quite clearly the people against the elite in these kind of crude terms, and in a very unliberal way. So I think it's quite interesting because I think that's another thing we can see here. So Muddle and Kaltwasser have defined populism as, and this again is something I think we all can agree on, this appeal to the people and a denunciation of the elite, as well as a critic of the establishment and an adulation of the common people. Now, most of the time Curtis does this in his films, but at times he actually does the opposite, which we can see in the following still. So this is a still from the most recent Can't Get You Out of My Head, where he actually posits that we the people are stupid. So that's quite different than what we may expect of a certain type of populism. So again, as I said before, I'm not saying that this is the case. I'm just saying that these are some ideas that appeal to me that I find interesting. So I would like to hear from you if you do have any questions. I don't really have much more to add, just that I would say that if the working classes were the grave diggers of capitalism for Marx, and the postmodernists were the grave diggers of Marxism for Jameson and Terry Eagleton, then and there should be a who here. I've just realized it's missing. Who will be the grave diggers of postmodernism? Apparently not contemporary documentary filmmakers. Okay, that I conclude with that remark. Thank you. I hope the technology held up and you were able to hear me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We will be back to discuss your presentation as well at the end. Our third speaker this afternoon is Temenuga Trifonova. She's an associate professor of cinema and media studies at York University in Toronto. She's the author of the monographs The Figure of the Migrant in Contemporary European Cinema, Warped Minds, Cinema and Psychopathology, and The Image in French Philosophy, an editor-contributor of the collections Contemporary Visual Culture and the Sublime and European Film Theory. Trifonova has been a Marie Curie Fellow at Le Studium Center for Advanced Studies in France and a visiting scholar in the American Academy in Rome, the New York University Center for European and Mediterranean Studies, the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Bologna, the Waseda Institute for Advanced Studies in Tokyo, and the Brown Foundation at the Dora Maar House. Her paper, Spectrology, Haunting and Ghosts in Contemporary European Cinema, will examine in detail the sometimes problematic ways in which several examples of contemporary European cinema engage with the ethical limits of Europeans' responsibility to the illegal other by relying on the trope of spectrality to underscore the co-presence of past and present. Professor Temenuga, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. You can start when you're ready. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for inviting me. So my paper is called Spectrality, Haunting and Ghosts in Contemporary European Cinema. And I'll just start. Oops, sorry. Not only has co-presence gradually emerged as the dominant theoretical paradigm to describe the migrants' or the refugees' deregulated experience of time and space, but co-presence has also come to dramatize a heightened historical consciousness, as evidenced by European films' growing tendency to frame the ethical questions raised by migrants and refugees in terms of past forms of oppression and marginalization, with the Holocaust serving as the ultimate ground for legitimation. Not surprisingly, the trope of ghosting or haunting recurs regularly in these films. Esther Perrin has explored spectrality as a metaphor for both the dispossession and empowerment of certain subjects, including migrants and refugees, who are regularly perceived as living ghosts. In this paper, I examine the ways in which a number of recent films engage with the ethical limits of Europeans' responsibility to the illegal other by relying on the trope of spectrality to underscore the co-presence of past and present. By blurring the boundaries between past, present, and future and approaching contemporary problems through a magical, farcical, or absurdist lens, sometimes, the films foreground the historical continuity between various forms of injustice and exploitation, ultimately revealing the relentless reproduction of violence as a cycle seemingly without end. An early predecessor to these films is Gianni Amelio's L'America, 1994, which uses an amnesiac protagonist to explore the overlapping or mutual haunting of different historical periods and political regimes, fascism, communism, and global capitalism, in order to expose the continuities between them. While the film opens with a newsreel about Albania's colonization by Mussolini's army in 1939, the story proper begins 50 years later, as fascism and communism have both supposedly become a thing of the past. Although Albania is no longer Italy's puppet fascist state, it has now entered the next new colonial phase of its national history, with desperate Albanians welcoming their former Italian colonizers who present themselves as Albania's benefactors. In 1999, following the fall of communism, Italian con artists Gino and Fiore traveled to a lawless Albania to set up a fake shoe factory in order to get their hands on Italian state subsidies to Albania's post-communist economy. Looking for a front for their company, they stumble upon a traumatized 70-year-old anti-communist political prisoner, Spiro, who has been driven mad and amnesiac by 20 years of hard labor in communist labor camps, and who looks indistinguishable from a concentration camp victim. Later, we find out that Spiro is not an anti-communist hero at all, but an Italian, Michele, who deserted Mussolini's army in 1939 and went into hiding under an Albanian name, but was never told that World War II ended. In the film's final sequence, Gino and Michele board a ship bound for Italy. A series of documentary-like close-ups of hundreds of undocumented immigrants on the ship, including Gino and Michele, who believes the boat is headed to L'America, cannot help but recall those of the 4 million impoverished Italians who immigrated to America in the beginning of the 20th century, fleeing rural poverty in southern Italy and later fascism. What historians René Sigrist and Stella Gervers have called the victim paradigm is particularly relevant to the conflation of different historical periods and political regimes in America, as well as in the other films I discuss. Throughout the 20th century, Sigrist and Gervers argue, Europe was a victim of two totalitarian systems, fascism and communism. The contemporary multicultural European cocktail of common values and bricolage of identities is a product of the attempts of various marginalized and oppressed groups, including migrants, ethnic minorities, gays, lesbians, refugees, stateless people, etc., to reclaim their identity by positioning themselves as victims of one or both of these systems, often relating their own oppression to previous forms of oppression in their own country or in other European countries. Sigrist and Gervers remain ambivalent about the victim paradigm. On one hand, they draw attention to its potential abuses by different groups, but they also suggest that it could potentially serve as the ground for a shared European identity. They argue that by challenging le lieu de mémoire nationale with their transnational claims, victim-based groups, such as second and third generation immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and so on, might offer a way to transcend the classical inter-European schisms that have so far defined European history and reform European values along the lines of compassion and solidarity. If the Jews offered Europe a way to define itself as lieu de mémoire, they argue, with the Holocaust serving as a source of a shared European memory or identity, these new victims, including migrants and refugees, might be seen as offering the newest European version of common identity, or common shared lieu de mémoire. Sigrist and Gervers' analysis of the victim paradigm illuminates the challenge that all of the films I analyze here face, the creation of a historical consciousness in and by cinema. If Sigrist and Gervers suggest that one historical event, the Holocaust, has become the ultimate ground of legitimation, Jean-Michel Frodon's edited volume, Cinema and the Shoah, makes clear what is really at stake in the creation of a historical consciousness. While Frodon posits the Shoah as the crisis of the visible and a question of and for cinema, arguing that its unrepresentability constitutes both the aesthetic and ethical criterion according to which films about the Shoah ought to be judged, others, like Marie-José Monzin, for instance, insist that thinking of the Shoah as unrepresentable, as radical evil, precludes the possibility of expressing the past in the present, of allowing the Shoah to enter history not in order to forget it, but precisely to make it live in the present. While I share Monzin's point of view, in the remainder of this paper, I want to draw attention to some of the challenges of making the past live in the present through the trope of haunting and spectrality, particularly in terms of these challenges that I'm going to talk about, particularly in terms of downplaying the historical particularity of the different experiences the films recount, and confusing or making ambiguous the political stance of the films in question. I start with the film Happy as Lazaro. Happy as Lazaro tells the story of a group of villagers exploited as unpaid labor to harvest tobacco for the Marchesa, despite the outlawing of sharecropping as a practice in Italy in the early 1980s. That the film is intended as a political allegory is clear from its purposeful withholding of any temporal and spatial coordinates. One memorable sequence, for example, which I was not able to find to show you a picture of, so instead I'm showing you this image. One memorable sequence from the film in which Lazaro walking towards the city, joins a crowd of unemployed illegal immigrants of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, paints a potent picture or image of the reproduction of the system of inequalities, with the peasants and workers of the past now replaced by the refugees and illegal migrants of the present. The film shows the perpetuation of class inequalities by tracing the historical continuity between the aristocracy and the petite bourgeoisie of the past, embodied here by the characters of Nicola and the Marchesa, and the exploiters of the present, which in the film suggests the European Central Bank and the traffickers of illegal labor, like the older Nicola, who recruits illegal workers by auctioning available jobs to those who offer to do them for the least amount of money. Although Lazaro is a figure with whom any Europeans who perceive themselves as disenfranchised in some way can identify, a figure onto which different social groups can project their own claims phrased in terms of victimhood. This figure's main symbolic function in the film is to represent the reproduction of class relations rather than the attainment of class consciousness. In fact, I would argue Lazaro could be seen as an embodiment of false consciousness. Whether Lazaro is a slave or a saint, and he is represented as both in the film, depends on whether he is a subject in Rancière's sense of the term, and thus conscious of his position in the social, political, and economic order. The film's ending suggests that Lazaro becomes conscious of and indeed reacts to the suffering and injustice that he both suffers and witnesses. But what exactly does he become conscious of? What injustice does he seek to correct in the final sequence of the film when he goes to the bank? Has he finally become aware of the injustices perpetrated against him and against the inhabitants of the little village in Violata, who, even after seemingly being emancipated from their feudal position, continue to be exploited and abandoned by the same system that claimed to have emancipated them? Not really. At one point in the film, the older Tancredi invites Lazaro and the other villagers to lunch at his house, but they're turned away by Tancredi's wife, who explains to them that the bank has ruined the Marquesas family and confiscated all her properties, to which Lazaro exclaims, "The great swindle." Although Antonia and the others remind him that the great swindle refers to their own victimization and oppression at the hands of the Marquesa, Lazaro is deeply moved by what he perceives to be a great injustice done to the Marquesas family. He has finally become class conscious, but only ironically conscious of the injustices suffered by the wrong class. In the last scene, he goes to the bank to demand that Marquesa's properties be returned to her. But since the villagers, including himself, used to belong to the Marquesa, what he's actually demanding is his and the others' re-enslavement. Lazaro, I argue, is no longer the saintly figure he was in the beginning of the film, but a reactionary figure, nostalgic for the old pre-new liberal form of oppression, which for him does not even represent oppression, but simply the natural state of things. In short, he's an obstacle to class struggle. It is not Lazaro in the end, but the former farmhands, now the lumpen proletariat, who at the end of the film begin to show signs of class consciousness as they, for the first time, consider the possibility of resistance. And here I'm referring to one of the characters, Pipo's suggestion, half-joking suggestion, to return to the village and squat to the Marquesa's house without bosses. Like Lazaro, Transit, Christian Petzold's films, Transit, an adaptation of Anna Seger's 1944 novel, also called Transit, is an allegory explicitly engaged with Europe's current political and humanitarian crisis, with Petzold intentionally keeping the temporal coordinates vague so as to allow the echoes of the past, specifically the Holocaust, to reverberate in the present and vice versa. The time warping in the film produces some interesting effects, which is especially noticeable in the sequence showing the main character's Georg's night escape from Paris to Marseille, accompanied by his wounded friend Heinz, whose wife Melissa and son Driss are waiting for him in Marseille. While the shots of the trains cannot fail but recall the trains transporting millions of Jews to the death camps, this reference to the past is deliberately conflated with the more recent visual memory of thousands of illegal migrants and refugees trying to enter Europe locked up in the back of trucks, many of them suffocating to death. Here, the political allegory flattens all temporal distinctions. The current refugee crisis is figured metaphorically through a reference to the Holocaust, while at the same time the dystopian present or future day Holocaust depicted by the film, literally and realistically, rather than metaphorically, is figured through a reference back to the current refugee crisis. With the introduction of the characters of Melissa and Driss, the little boy that you see in the image here, both of Maghrebi origin and both illegal immigrants in France, France's colonial past adds a third temporal layer to that of the 1940s and the 2000s, with France's Boer population becoming the third victimized group in the series of transnational and transhistorical cases of victimhood explored in the film. France's colonial legacy, the Holocaust, and the refugee crisis, the first decidedly French, the other two European phenomena, enter into a symbolic chain of mutually exchangeable identities. Basically, a Boer is a Jew, is a refugee. Although the narrative's temporal complexity and allegorical function are central to the film, Transit is not so much about the refugee crisis or the Holocaust, or even about the continuity between the two. Petzold is mostly interested in exploring the existential experience of passing through, the temporal and spatial disruption of an existence suspended between the past and the future, there and here, then and now, in the limbo of co-presence. In an interview with Franz Rogowski, the actor who plays the main character, Georg, he comments on the difficulty of playing a character who is supposed to inhabit two temporal frames at the same time. Quote, Georg is a refugee, therefore he has lost his home, but he is also a ghost that starts his journey in Germany's 1940s. He's actually born in a novel in the book of a German writer, and he finds himself in today's Marseille. But also, Georg is a drifter. There's not much he could lose. He has no family, there's no apartment or work. End of quote. When Rogowski describes Georg as a drifter and explicitly states later in the interview that he was not trying to represent a refugee, he urges us to see Georg not as a specific historical figure, but as an allegorical figure representing any kind of existential sense of displacement, homelessness, or exile. Tellingly, at one point in the film, Georg tells an allegorical Kafkaesque story about a man who had to report to hell and waited for years in front of a door only to be informed that this is hell. The collapsing of spatial and temporal markers in Happy as Lazaro and Transit, which renders ethnic, racial, and political differences as a symbolic chain of mutually exchangeable identities, a Boer is a Jew is a refugee, is becoming something of a genre trope in films exploring Europe's current predicament. Filmed in close quarters in an allotment area in the center of Vienna that recalls the self-enclosed artificial space of a refugee camp, the film Nobody, 2019, tells the story of an aging, taciturn Robert who, following the death of his dog, needs help to bury him. Adib, a young Afghani refugee,
Sorry, Temenuga, sorry, we stopped hearing you. I think you muted your sound. I'm sorry for this inconvenience. We just have to wait a little moment to understand what we are not receiving the sound in the conference room. Thank you for your understanding. We are having some technical problems on our hand in the auditorium where we are taking the the physical side of the conference. We will try to return as soon as possible. I'm very sorry for this interruption. I think we can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm very sorry for this interruption. I'm sorry to cut your presentation and your train of thought, but you can restart when you feel comfortable. Thank you.
How do you do it? How do I do that? Okay.
Yeah, we can see you. Yes, yeah, and hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So, talking about the film Nobody, tells the story of the aging taciturn Robert, who, following the death of his dog, needs help to bury him. And Adib, a young Afghani refugee desperately looking for work, offers his services despite his injured foot, injured during his journey to Europe. The film stages the conflict between the two men across political, racial, and generational lines, referencing in the same gesture the Odyssey, one of the core texts making up Europe's cultural heritage, and the absolute negation of that legacy, the Nazi past. The title of the film, Nobody, invokes the violation of refugees' human rights and the Nazi extermination of the Jews. The collapsing of temporal and historical difference manifests itself as well in the film's conflation of the figures of victim and victimizer through that of nobody, a figure clearly intended to mediate between them. Just as Adib's tattoo, Nobody, brands him as another anonymous victim. By the way, he gave himself that name, Nobody, while he was in the refugee camp. Just as Adib's tattoo, Nobody, brands him as another anonymous victim, Robert's tattoo, which, like the tattoos of all SS members, identifies his blood group as 0, brands him as Nobody. His blood type references both the destruction of life, the extermination of the Jews, and the erasure of responsibility on the part of the Nazi. Thus, Nobody invokes in the same breath bare life, suppressed guilt, and nobodism on top of that. Since Nobody also is the pseudonym used by Odysseus, the nomad. Like Nobody, the Barefoot Emperor mines the trope of spectrality to underscore the co-presence of past and present, though here in a more surrealist vein. In this toothless political satire, the Belgian king, returning home from Istanbul after learning that during his absence Wallonia has seceded and Belgium no longer exists, is mistakenly shot in Sarajevo during a theatrical reenactment of Ferdinand's 1914 assassination, and later finds himself in an exclusive sanatorium housed in Tito's former summer home, where he's informed that his shooting has sparked the end of the EU and the rise of Nova Europa, to be ruled by a new emperor who turns out to be none other than the Belgian king himself. The film's scrambled historical references from the disintegration of Yugoslavia, seen here as a precedent for the EU's collapse, to Hitler, Mussolini, Che Guevara, Ceausescu, to name but a few, turn European history into a hall of mirrors in which the lines between past and present, politics and popular culture, and between different political ideals are rendered meaningless. For example, each patient in the sanatorium is named after the room in which various stars from the world of politics and entertainment resided back in Tito's time. The Belgian king is now Brezhnev. Other patients are called Indira Gandhi, Castro, Arafat, Elizabeth Taylor, and so on. The film's politics remains ambiguous. While it suggests the idea of a paradoxically united Europe of nationalists, led for some inexplicable reason by an emperor, even though the European Parliament has been abolished, it also fails to develop in a more nuanced, not merely allegorical way, some of its crass political jokes. For example, the idea that migrants used to be a problem until they became a business. The film's ending, too, is undernourished, though clearly allegorical in its literalness, in the way it imagines the potential rebirth of Europe from the ashes of nationalism, communism, and fascism. The future of Europe, the ending suggests, is contingent upon Europeans' ability to literally put themselves in refugees' shoes. And so in the end, the king and his entourage were able to return to Brussels only by being smuggled back illegally by a group of Indian climate refugees. Finally, the last film I'll talk about, Tony Kravitz's Dead Europe, draws on several genres: supernatural horror, historical drama, Holocaust film, refugee film, ghost story, road movie, to tell an allegorical story about contemporary Europe, imagined here as an underground network of illegality, exploitation, racial prejudice, and anti-Semitism, and visually as a series of camp-like neighborhoods and refugee-populated apartment buildings whose homogeneity makes the different cities where the action takes place, Athens, Paris, and Budapest, indistinguishable. By lumping together all problems plaguing Europe, from racial prejudice and anti-Semitism through drug problems and the porno industry to the refugee crisis and religious conflicts, the film feeds into the familiar migrancy problematic, which blames migrants and refugees for all of Europe's social, political, and economic problems. The film, which figures the co-presence of past and present through the familiar trope of the family curse, traces the journey of Isaac, a young Greek-Australian gay photographer, back to his ancestral homeland, where he uncovers his family's secret past. When Isaac tells his father, Vasily, a former Communist Party member, that he is going to Athens for a gallery exhibition of his work, his father drives off in his car at a suicidal speed, eventually dying in a car crash. Isaac takes his father's ashes back to his Greek birthplace, where he gradually learns of a family curse. In Athens, Isaac meets a young refugee, Joseph, and begins taking photographs of him. At one point, he has to leave to recharge his camera, and when he returns, Joseph is gone. Throughout the rest of his European journey, Isaac is haunted by the image of Joseph, a metaphor for a past wrong that Isaac and his family can never make right. Like Transit, Dead Europe posits anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant attitudes as two faces of the same coin. The dark secret Isaac eventually uncovers concerns a Jewish boy, Elias, whom Isaac's father and his family offered to protect during the war in exchange for money, but eventually betrayed. Isaac's grandmother raped the boy, and Isaac's father did nothing to prevent it, instead waiting until the boy was almost dead and killing him. Figuring the family sin primarily as one of sexual assault, rape, and only secondarily as murder sets the tone for the whole film, which frames the gay cause. Isaac, remember, is gay, and his brother Nico is a junkie working in the gay porn industry, through a reference to the Holocaust. Significantly, when Elias, the Jewish boy Isaac's father betrayed, returns as a ghost, haunting Isaac's family, it is in the guise of the young refugee Joseph. Thus, like the other films discussed here, Dead Europe depicts the claims of three different groups, Jews, gays, and refugees, as mutually exchangeable, downplaying or erasing the historical particularity of their experiences and referring them all back to the Holocaust as the ultimate ground for legitimation. Thank you. I might have gone a little bit over time, sorry.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We will be opening now the conversation with both our physical audience and our virtual audience. I will start maybe by making a question to each one of us and each one of you, and you can answer. I will make the three questions first, and you can later answer. To Rita, I haven't seen this film of Oliveira, but it seems I'm even more interested now to watch it than I was, and I was already very interested to watch it before. And this idea of mirror and death, it's very interesting that this idea of mirror as a death or a portal reminded me of Cocteau films, Orpheus and Blood of a Poet, where there is a mirror that is a kind of a portal to death, and this figure of Orpheus combines on both hands the artistic gesture and figure of death. This character has both it's kind of a conjunction of these two things. I would like to ask you what you think of this as a possibility, this connection between death and art, relating to this film, but also in general, and how it can be a way of transforming the real. To Matthew, I'm very interested in these films of Adam Curtis, and the question I would like to ask you is if this concept of normal this idea of normalization can also be a form of epistemic violence. I would like to ask you to talk a little bit about your thoughts on how all the specters, both the ones you mentioned, postmodernism and populism, but also we can also talk about communism and other specters, if they don't emerge as a reaction to this process of normalization and, more importantly, the status quo, which is a figure that Curtis criticizes and tries to deconstruct often. And finally, to Temenuga, I would like to ask you. I'm not sure if you probably are. This discussion of the irrepresentable. It's a very interesting question. This is a very old debate in European cinema. Maybe the most famous of this controversies is the critique that Rivette and later Serge Daney made of Capot by Gilles Pontecorvo. I would like to ask you what's your opinion on how this debate has changed, and how do you see this relation between its historical and also the discussion that you mentioned about Marie-Josée Mondrian, and so I would like you to talk a little bit more about this debate in the contemporary cinema, how you see it. Thank you.
Shall I start?
Yeah, you can start. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I think I've spoke about the relations between death and the mirroring, quoting a line from Fernando Guerreiro, where he says that death is an opaque mirror, and to be able to break it through this opaque mirror full of dirt and earth and all the decomposing matters that goes inside this opaque mirror, for to see a vivid face, to see something appear. He says you need to hallucinate. You need to go as in poetry. So it's interesting that parallel with Cocteau film, since I see it as a dig, a beautiful hallucination exercise to meet art and death, poetry and death, in trying to dig through this mystery. And in the middle you see all the ghosts operating. I think what is comes to the surface is the ghosts that are operating in this hallucination and in this mirror, and you can and by that exercise, sometimes the world of ghosts can offer an enhancing of reality. Sometimes can offer some ways to see a little bit further through this hallucination. You can have a glimpse of something that it's not visible in the nearby reality, but it becomes more visible suddenly in this world of ghosts, in this hallucination, in this spectral mirror. So, I think Manuel de Oliveira was kind of intuitively making this exercise with this crazy overlapping with the film sets and fiction sets, the spaces and the figures and the portraits and all of that, and managed to give an amazing film. I think Angelic it's you can speak and find every time you see it, you can find new movements, new digging, new works of the ghosts. The ghosts are always operating there. It's endless. Thank you. Matthew, I think pass the word to you.
Sure, yeah. Sorry, I was trying to unmute the microphone. Well, I think the question that you posed, João Pedro, is a good one. I'm not sure that Curtis's vision is actually very clear at all. So I think that what I do find interesting is that the concept hypernormalization was originally coined by the Soviet Russian writer, right, Alexei Yurchak. So I find it quite interesting that he juxtaposes, or he moves this idea that was framed in a kind of context of economic stagnation and sort of misery to a period of great economic progress and ostensible achievement, and still makes it work to some extent. But as I said, on the other hand, his films are so long that at times it seems that, you know, everything's sort of making sense, it's coherent, and then something will kind of tear that all up, you know. So, and I don't know if that's deliberate really or not. I've seen Curtis speak quite a lot, and I think that he seems to deliver the same types of messages time and time again, but still says things which seem perhaps a bit contradictory, you know. But I think one of the things that interests me the most, just to finish, is this idea of history. So it's clear that Curtis is interested in history because, in fact, he has described himself as a historian. Interestingly, he seems to have a bit of a crisis though with how to define himself, which is perhaps also interesting because he refuses to consider himself an artist, which is perhaps very interesting, perhaps the most interesting thing. But this interest in history that he clearly has in trying to reclaim an understanding of history, but the way that his films are set up seems to me to be, you know, precisely to do precisely the opposite, which is to totally reduce history just to secondary, temporary images over the top of house music, you know, in a way which is kind of instantly gratifying and enjoyable and exciting, but I'm not really sure how the audience can take anything from it, you know. So I don't know, it's complex, isn't it? But certainly interesting material.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't really know how to answer your question because I'm not sure if you are asking me basically where I stand in that debate, because I'm not sure where I really stand, because the question that you're asking is very general, like philosophical, I guess, because basically what you're asking is what that debate asks, the debate about Capo, but also any film about the Holocaust is, you know, what is representable? How do we represent the horrifying? And I don't think that there is one, I don't think that we can, because there have been some films that have been more, I don't want to use the word successful than others, but for example, a film like Night and Fog by Alain Resnais, I find, I don't even know what adjectives to use, is better or more successful at representing the Holocaust than Capo. But my point here was not to focus, even though I did refer to that discussion, that debate, I didn't want to really focus so much on the representation of the Holocaust, but I just wanted to raise the question of to what extent allegories in general, because most of the films that I'm talking about employ some form of allegory, which is another way to say that they use the notion of specters and ghosts to point to certain similarities, structural similarities between different historical experiences. To what extent the use of political allegory is successful in these films. And my point was precisely that I find that even though politically I tend to agree with where these films are positioning themselves, something about the story or the aesthetic or the use of the haunting and spectral trope, the trope of spectrality, kind of ends up by undermining or pushing the film in almost the opposite direction. Those are the moments that I try to isolate. So, and that's yeah, I don't know if I have anything more to say other than it's the question that I still haven't answered myself, you know, to what extent allegory works in these films that try to kind of create some kind of historical consciousness about the continuity between different historical experiences.
Thank you. I think now it's time to open. We have a question over there.
Hi. Hi, good evening. I have a question for Matthew. I've made some notes here. I will read it. So I've seen all 6 episodes of Can't Get You Out of My Head recently, And I have an overall first impression, and I should say I haven't really wrapped up my mind over it because I'm still processing. It's a lot of content, but I perceive the argument of the central thesis of the whole series as a mise en abîme about the strength and capacity of human minds to create sense and to give significance to chaos. In a way, is what Curtis does in all the series, right? He creates a series of links between unusual found footage, links you wouldn't do right away. So I think it's a meta-linguistical comment on the series. And in the end, I had this feeling that he was stating that those who control the narrative or the elaboration of the symbolic, like Facebook, I don't know, communication conglomerates, they are the ones who constitute the real. So I saw the series much more in a psychoanalytical approach about language, about constitution of reality, I don't know, and not as much as in this way of apocalyptical, dystopia, simulacra, postmodernism. So I had a different reading in the end of the series. I felt it was more positive, the ending much more as a call for the audience to be awakened or for struggle or fight politically for this narrative. Considering that we live in times of fake news, well. So I had this different approach. In the end, I think also he says that we can construct any world or imaginary we can imagine. So I'm not sure if it was a naive approach or a naive lecture of the series, so I wish you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, first thing I would say is that I'm not an expert in anything, right? And certainly not in Adam Curtis. Your view of those films is just as legitimate as mine is. So, I make no claim to be some kind of superior intellectual authority. For me, it's all about interpretation. So I think the fact that you've interpreted those films in a much more optimistic way through psychoanalysis is great, and probably it says, probably the way that, well, maybe certainly, perhaps not probably at all, the way that we interpret our interests, right? I've noticed how much my interests reflect me as a person. So, maybe I'm just too pessimistic or something. I have this kind of negative thing that I have, and that I'm drawn to these negative depictions and things like that. But I think because Hypernormalization, the second film out of the three that I mentioned, is really the one that I enjoyed the most and I've watched the most. And that one, I think I have to say, I'm not sure whether you also had a positive interpretation of that one, but for me, that is overwhelmingly pessimistic and cynical, while simultaneously being somehow quite truthful or accurate in some sense. To me, it does make sense of so many things, but in a very, pessimistic way. I don't want to keep using the same terms, but no, I found very interesting what you said. Thank you. I don't think I can add anything more profound.
Any more questions? Okay, so I think we should be ending now. We will have now a short break before the next session. It will be our next keynote, Ulrich Baer, and we will be back in about 30 minutes. Thank you very much to all the speakers for your wonderful presentations. Thank you very much to all both our audiences, and see you in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.